It's good. Okay. So Mr. Tony Palermo has worked for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for over 20 years in the Office of Law Enforcement. He currently holds the position of Supervisory Wildlife Inspector, where day-to-day duties include performing wildlife inspection or wildlife import and export inspections. He also implements and promotes compliance with a number of wildlife laws at the Port of Honolulu, including the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty, the Wild Bird Conservation Act, and the Convention of International Trade in Endangered Fauna and Flora, also known as CITES, and the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So prior to starting his career at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Tony was also a NOAA fisheries observer in Hawaii and Alaska, where he also completed his college education at Southern Illinois University. So if everyone could give Mr. Tony Palermo a round of applause as he gives us information about CITES today.
Thank you for that introduction, Helen. I really appreciate it. And thank you guys for welcoming me. I'll go ahead and share my screen here in a second. And we'll have some time, I think, hopefully 25 minutes or so, and some time for some questions is what I would plan for. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. Okay, can everyone see that? Can you see that, Helen? We good?
We're good.
Okay, terrific. Again, thank you for that introduction, Helen. As she said, my name is Tony Palermo, and I am a Supervisory Wildlife Inspector with the Office of Law Enforcement here in Honolulu, Hawaii. And today I have the pleasure to bring you some information about CITES and law enforcement and CITES protection, permits, and the process. So let's get started. The topics that I'm going to cover for the day are an overview of the Office of Law Enforcement, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Fauna and Flora, better known as CITES, CITES protection, CITES permits, import, export, COSIs, etc., as well as the import-export process. The Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement's mission is to protect and enhance fish, wildlife, and their habitats. And how we do this is by investigating violations of U.S. wildlife protection laws, regulations, and treaties. We monitor the U.S. wildlife trade. That's the Wildlife Inspection Program specifically. We also help Americans understand and obey wildlife laws. And we work in partnership with international, federal, state, and tribal counterparts to be able to reach this end. So I wanted to start with a little bit of the scope of the wildlife trade. It is thought that the illicit trade in wildlife is only second in value to the trade in illegal drugs. The illegal trade can have dramatic effects on wildlife. Over 350 million animals are imported every particular year into the United States. And if I would have had this as an animated screen, I would ask you guys, what's the largest consumer of wildlife? And see from your screen there, it's China. The United States is second in that number. Recently overtaking weapons, the trade in wildlife is estimated to be more than $20 billion a year. Illegal wildlife trade is estimated at 8 to 10 billion. As species become rare, the value for collectors of those specimens increase. In addition to the value, many known drug smugglers are involved in the trade of illegal wildlife and source countries for drug smugglers, and often the countries most involved in the illicit trade in wildlife. So habitat destruction, as we probably all know, is one of the greatest threats to our wildlife, but the trade in wildlife has a dramatic effect on many species. Here in the photo that you see, There are some jambayas knives. These are Yemenis knives, and the handle of the knife has rhino horn on it. And so you can see that from the inset, it shows you know, some of the slaughter that occurs to be able to get the horn from the animal, and then it's fashioned into that handle that is prized for cultural significance. It's really, it's utilized for that purpose. So I'll give you a little quick background of the wildlife inspection program. The first wildlife inspectors were hired in 1976. And the reason why they were hired is because the Endangered Species Act was passed in the years prior to 1976. So wildlife inspectors across the country came on board very, very slowly with a few at a time. And initially, it was New York at JFK, which saw the first wildlife inspectors. Wildlife inspectors facilitate the movement of legal wildlife shipments while ensuring compliance with US and international wildlife protection laws. We provide a deterrence against wildlife smuggling, and we work closely with governmental and non-governmental agencies on international trade issues. Think Traffic, World Wildlife Fund, Defenders of Wildlife, those organizations. We have wildlife inspector offices spread out across the country. As you can see from this image, the stars on this image are all wildlife inspector port offices or designated port in the green stars. The red dots are border ports, special ports, border ports obviously in the north and the southern border, as well as we have a port that I supervise in Guam. And so the territories are also included, and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands also has a wildlife inspection office with wildlife inspectors and special agents. There's a couple other areas throughout the country that I want to make note of. To the west, you'll see our forensics laboratory. Our forensics laboratory is a top-notch laboratory that has scientists of different disciplines, morphology, genetics, etc. And they're the problem solvers as far as when wildlife inspectors or special agents send them their items to be identified or for cause of death. They're just an amazing group of scientists. And if you ever get a chance, the lab is located in Ashland, Oregon, Southern Oregon. The next point I want to note is that there's a repository in Denver, Colorado, which most of our items go for educational purposes if they're not destroyed locally after our seizures. And then last but not least, on the East Coast in Georgia, we have a federal law enforcement training center, which is the acronym FLETC. And that's where all wildlife inspectors and special agents go to get trained of the laws of which they will be implementing and the authority that we have. That's the school. For wildlife inspectors, it's about 6 or 8 weeks. And for special agents, it's about 6 months. So I'm going to briefly discuss some of the other legislation that we're going to be talking about today. Obviously, I had mentioned the Endangered Species Act, and then CITES, or the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Fauna and Flora. The Endangered Species Act is the big one here, and that's what we're going to be spending the rest of our time with talking about, as well as the CITES and the implementation of CITES. CITES is a treaty, okay, and we'll get into that a little bit more, but I think that the Endangered Species Act actually promulgates and gives us the authority under the Endangered Species Act to regulate and to enforce CITES as a country, the United States. Some of the other regulating wildlife statutes or acts that we oversee and have the authority to institute is the Lacey Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Migratory Bird Act, the Bald Eagle and Golden Eagle Protection Act, Wild Bird Conservation Act, the African Elephant Conservation Act, and the Rhino Tiger Conservation Act, as well as the Captive Wildlife Safety Act. So what is wildlife? I wanted to make a definition so that I can show you what broadly encompasses wildlife here, because it's not maybe what you would completely think of. But fish or wildlife means any wild animal, whether alive, dead, including without limitation, any wild mammal, bird, reptile, amphibian, fish, mollusk, crustacean, arthropod, coelenterate, or other invertebrate. Here's the big point: whether or not bred, hatched, or born in captivity, including their parts, their products, their eggs, and their offspring, okay? So it's a wide encompassing definition for wildlife, except some of those domesticated species, okay? So I'm not gonna read down the list of domesticated species, but those are what you would normally think of as domesticated. Those do not require any type of Fish and Wildlife declaration to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So now we're going to spend the rest of the time speaking about CITES and the Endangered Species Act. CITES, on the bottom there, you can see where you can go to the website, cites.org, and it will give you a wealth of information about the structure and how the appendices are enforced. And then the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act obviously is a United States statute, and you can find information from www.fws.gov/endangered. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few seconds. Okay, so CITES in a nutshell, all right? CITES provides a legal framework to regulate international trade and CITES specimens between two CITES parties and trade with non-party members. There's national legislation is essential to implement the provisions of CITES in each party. CITES provides for a series of basic structural mechanism or structural basic procedural mechanisms that are exactly the same for all parties. And what I mean by that is that all CITES permits are standardized, okay? So if you look at a CITES permit for the United States, it should look the same as a CITES permit that Italy, France, the EU issues. And then the last point is that CITES provides a basic structure and division for responsibilities that are the same for all parties. So the division of responsibilities include a management authority, which we'll talk a little bit about, a scientific authority, and a branch of permitting. So each country that are party members require that structure in order to be fully participating in the treaty. So CITES, as I had mentioned, is international trade. And currently there's 183 different countries that are party member to CITES. Non-party countries must still abide by CITES, the requirements when shipping to a CITES party country, okay? So here in the Pacific, we have a wealth of islands. We're an island nation, and in Oceania, there are many, many countries or many island nations that do not belong to CITES, but they still have to implement, you know, the CITES provisions when there's trade going on between, let's say, the Marshall Islands or the Federated States of Micronesia and the United States, Hawaii. CITES applies to live and preserved specimens alike, and as well as parts and derivatives thereof. So CITES is all about a degree of protection, okay? So I know that everyone is familiar with CITES, but you may not understand the different levels or the degrees of protection that are required in order to for CITES to run. Okay, so there are 3 different degrees of protection, 3 appendices. There are 36,000 species of animals and plants that comprise the total list of the appendices. Okay, so CITES Appendix 1 are species that are threatened with extinction, and international trade is generally prohibited. CITES Appendix 2, on the other hand, which composes of 65% animal and 35% plant species, is the brunt of CITES species. And really that's where species are not necessarily taxed with extinction, but they are regulated, okay? And so a permit process will be required for the transfer internationally of these specimens. And really international commerce and trade is allowed, but it is controlled. And we'll get into that a little bit more. In CITES Appendix 3 you can consider it basically the same protection level as CITES Appendix 2. It's a little more specific with national legislation and how countries list some of their native wildlife and fauna, as well as flora for that matter. So just an interesting side note is that there's 10 million CITES trade interactions reported by the parties in the last decade. So that's 70% include animals, and the other 22% include plants. On the right side of the screen, please note that species included in the appendices must fulfill 3 conditions. So this is what is the CITES Secretariat implements and requires each country to properly do. There must be a legal, sustainable, and traceable means for the specimens that are being traded. So, for example, legally, the parties must have a legal acquisition finding and be able to make sure that there are laws and regulations that are implemented when people break the law regarding that, regarding CITES. It must be sustainable. Parties must make a non-detriment finding, and that's a science-based finding that confirms that a species is actually sustainable for trade, okay? Last but not least, it needs to be traceable. There's the branch of permits. It's a permitting system that needs to be traced. So parties must ensure that the trade is traced through the issuance and the control of appropriate CITES permits and certificates. Parties report all of their permits and their certificates that are issued on a national level to the CITES Secretariat in Geneva, Switzerland on an annual basis. And that all gets compiled into the CITES trade database. So that is done in our Washington, DC office, and I'll talk a little bit about that more in a minute. So going on with the theme of the degrees of protection, just to drill down a little bit more, CITES Appendix 1, there's no commercial trafficking of wildlife whatsoever. CITES import and export permits are required from the countries that are involved. CITES Appendix 1 species that are bred in captivity are considered CITES Appendix 2, okay? And Helen would like this. I put down the American crocodile photo as an Appendix 1 species, also endangered, down there as one of the images that I included for my CITES Appendix 1 slide. CITES Appendix 2 is trade is permitted. And like I had mentioned on that last slide, trade with CITES Appendix 2 is the brunt of international trade. It must be sustainable, like I had mentioned, and export and re-export CITES permits are required from the exporting or re-exporting country in this case. The United States issues permits for exports of, let's say, here. per se. Appendix 3. Appendix 3, like I had mentioned, commercial trade is permitted again and controlled, and it's the same permitting system. Export and re-export CITES permits or a country of origin certificates would be required for that, for that transaction. Non-CITES member countries, okay? So I had mentioned the fact that some countries are just not party members to CITES. So what happens when there's trade? Well, it's still a requirement of CITES that a document with a statement of non-detriment be issued by the proper authority when one country is a CITES party country that's trading with another country that's being the exporting country that's a non-party member. They still require an authority that's listed in CITES, and a CITES permit, like I mentioned earlier with the standard, that's still required to take place in order for the trade to occur. I'm going to get into a little bit of the specifics of some of the ways that our other permits are issued from our headquarters. And one of them is called a Certificate of Scientific Exchange. Now, here's where folks like the Bishop Museum, the University of Hawaii, and other institutions can get registered with CITES in order to trade specimens, okay? It's only between registered institutions now, which is a big take-home point. And I did a little research on CITES, and I noticed that the University of Hawaii, the Joseph F. Rock Herbarium has a CITES, right here, the CITES permit number for plants. And then a COSI permit number is below that. And then it's the validity date is below that. So whoever's the register for the university for the Rock Herbarium, your permit is expired and you have to go ahead and get another COSI before you go ahead and exchange any specimens with another country, okay? The Department of Zoology for the University of Hawaii is not a party registered institution per se yet, but there are like HIMB would be one of them, and they maintain that record, as well as like the Bishop Museum would have an active COSI or scientific exchange certificate. So scientific exchange certificates are only authorized for non-commercial loan, donation or exchange between scientists or scientific institutions registered by a management authority of a state for preserved, dried, or embedded specimens, herbarium specimens, and live plant material which carry a label issued or approved by that specific management authority. Okay? What does the scientific COSI certificate not include? Okay, scientific exchange does not cover eagles, migratory birds, endangered species, marine mammals, or live animals. So a COSI cannot be used to import specimens collected by field researchers unless those specimens were first ascensioned into a collection of a registered facility in that particular country of origin, is the big point and the big take home there. So how is the permitting structure and how does the process work for the United States, you might ask? CITES export and re-export permits. So who issues them and how long are they valid for, and some of the specifics of what are they authorized for? They are issued by our DMA, okay? So our DMA is the Division of Management Authority, which is housed in Washington, DC, and they can issue CITES Appendix 1 permits, as well as CITES Appendix 2, but they issue CITES Appendix 1, 2, Wild Bird Conservation Act permits, Migratory Bird Treaty Act permits, endangered species permits, and the permits take anywhere from, I wouldn't say even 30 days, I would say 60 days and beyond once your application gets received in Washington, D.C. So if anybody is an active researcher on the call today, really planning is of utmost paramount as far as getting your CITES permit if you need a U.S. CITES permit to export, or if there's a CITES Appendix 1 species that's required a permit. Please note the times and start early. Also, what they look for is a proof of legal import and proof of legal acquisition. Okay, so if you're going to be asked for a re-export or an export permit from the United States, we're looking for specific information like a declaration form. When did it come into the country? If it's a re-export permit, does it have a cleared declaration? Was the permit looked at by a wildlife inspector at one of those ports that I had mentioned across the United States? Okay, so the ones that we can issue at the port level are CITES Appendix 2 re-export permits. And like I had mentioned, it requires a proof of legal import. So we want to do our homework because we don't want to issue permits that don't, that were not legally imported in the United States for stuff that's being re-exported. Okay, as far as exports, let's say an alligator farm wants to export to Italy. Well, there's going to be needing to be tags on those, and we want to make sure that it's a bona fide, let's say if it's a captive breeding facility down in Louisiana, per se, then we want to make sure that they are vetted so that we know. All right. I want to talk briefly a little bit about hybrids. So hybrid species are obviously, you guys are all zoology aficionados and experts here. And so I don't need to tell you what the species, what hybridization would be per se, but as far as a mixing and matching of CITES species when they hybridize, CITES Appendix 1 bred with a CITES Appendix 2 species becomes a CITES Appendix 2 species. All CITES hybrids require CITES permits, okay? And then on the right-hand side there, we're talking about the Endangered Species Act. So listed species, both listed, obviously they require an ESA or an endangered species permit to be able to do legal trade amongst internationally. A listed species and a non-listed endangered species would equal no permit would be required for that particular animal. Exemptions to CITES, okay? So we have a personal baggage exemption for CITES Appendix 2 and 3. What does that mean? That means that no CITES permit would actually be required upon import in the United States if it's bona fide personal baggage, CITES Appendix 2 or 3, and it's not of a commercial, it's not of large quantities, okay? Household moves, if you're moving your residence over to the EU per se, then your household move Appendix 2 and 3 species within that move would be exempt. In transit shipments, we don't issue any of the permits, but we do look for, wildlife inspectors will look for CITES permits from the country of origin or the country of export for that. These exportations only apply to CITES and they do not apply to foreign or other federal laws per se, like the Endangered Species Act, all right? Endangered species, there's no commercial trafficking whatsoever in the endangered species, and the Endangered Species Act requires permits for all activity, okay? So all activity, you'd have to see our Washington office, Division of Management Authority branch of permitting to be able to get an endangered species permit, unless it's written into another permit from an institution. Threatened species are exactly the same, no trafficking, and they still require permits for all activities. So I wanted to show you earlier, I mentioned where you could find information. I wanted to be a practical application for you folks. So this is the endangered species website for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it not only shows in your state, but it's international. So you could go ahead and do a search, for panda. And it'll include the status of the Endangered Species Act for panda bears, let's say, for example, internationally with regards to the Endangered Species Act. Okay. The next slide I have is the CITES website. And hopefully all of you will be able to spend a little time after this presentation to familiarize yourself. And I'll try, if I have some time, to show you some of the highlights and points of where you can find information on the CITES website. But at the top, you'll see those are all tabs. So home, discover CITES, programs, documents, resources, all that information opens up to a bunch of hyperlinks and more information about CITES and what it is, how it's implemented. Just so you know, also there's meetings every 2 to 3 years that are CITES, that are conferences for the parties. Conferences of the parties, they call it, or COP or COPE for short. And that's where all the countries get together to discuss and analyze uplisting or newly listing or downlisting of any of the CITES species that are listed to the appendices. I talked a little bit about permits. And so this is brand new. We just launched this this week. And so this e-permitting system allows folks to create an account and to go ahead and make permits, apply for a CITES permit through the Management Authority in the branch of permitting. Of note is, do I need a permit in the lower portion here? Would be a good place to start, and that gives you more information. I have my browser open again, and maybe I can peruse a little bit around in that particular site if time permits. So import procedures, 48-hour notice is required for our regulations for all arrivals, and the species is required. So this is where, in addition to declaring your importation, you require some other information for arrivals, especially if you're a researcher traveling through, international, I guess it would be through international airports. We want to know that so we can coordinate with you, okay? So you would check with the wildlife inspector at that particular port. Be sure to call or fax the information. Make sure that you have an appointment, and then make sure that you have your original CITES permit from that exporting country, or re-export permit if that's the case. Export procedure. So a lot of people get caught up and they just think that, it's required of them to, import their, or declare their importation. But honestly, export procedures are nearly identical to being able to export your native or your re-export, your re-imported wildlife. So same information occurs, and if it's a bird, you'll need a USDA permit. You'll need a copy of a vet certificate. Just bring all your original documents and make an arrangement with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wildlife inspector at your particular port of call. To be noted is that if it's a CITES species, okay, that IATA, there's an international regulations for airport transfer that's required for the container, the primary container that it's in. There's requirements specifically for the health and welfare of the animal. And failure to comply with the IATA regulation renders that particular CITES permit invalid. But we would not, if it's an export, obviously, we would ensure that you took care of that beforehand and talk to a wildlife inspector or come and saw, one of my staff at the wildlife inspector office here in Honolulu. So wildlife trade, like I had mentioned, it's a big business, but there's other institutions as far as what's traded between different countries. Obviously, zoos and other types of organizations trade wildlife for educational purposes. Importing wildlife in the United States. So all wildlife needs to be declared to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and everyone who is a commercial entity needs to make sure that they get licensed with the Fish and Wildlife Service prior to any transactions. With the exceptions of CITES and ESA or injurious species, shellfish and fisheries products are exempt from our regulations. So that's a note for folks like NOAA is concerned with. A lot of our regulations, there's no, for direct human consumption, there's no requirement to declare the specimens or the food consumption if it's for direct human consumption. And then all domestic animals, with the exception, are exempt from the Fish and Wildlife declaration process, which I had mentioned from earlier. So trade and listed species, commercial species that are traded CITES species must have a permit. All CITES species through the mail, okay, via, if it's courier, express courier, or whatever other DHL, FedEx, they must have a permit upon import. We don't honor retrospective permits per se, so everything needs to be in order. So prior to your import, again, it's behoove you to come and see one of the wildlife inspectors at one of the port offices. For non-commercial trade, US grants personal baggage exemptions for some I say, CITES Appendix 2 products. And like I said, I mentioned that's for, your person, on your person through, regular air cargo bag or regular, carry-on baggage or checked baggage, okay? Clearance procedures. So the requirements are you have to declare your wildlife to the Fish and Wildlife, have all original permits, have a copy of the bill of lading. You have to have an import-export license if that's actually what you're doing as far as your commerciality. And we have a fee-structured program to be able to send wildlife inspectors out to do their jobs. This is what the wildlife declaration looks like. It's really now a lot online, but this is a basic form that it looks like. And this is what it looks like if it's going to be cleared by myself or another wildlife inspector. There'll be a red stamp that's available in the bottom if it is one of these hard copy paper declarations. So, I know that I've went through a lot of information. I think I have some time to be able to go and take some questions. Here's my contact information. Maybe I can try to show you a little bit around CITES if you'd like. Helen or Bob, if you want to, chime in and let me know. But I hope that this information was helpful for you. And obviously, I'm available to help with any of this types of research or importing or exporting that the university, Bishop Museum, or anybody else will be doing.
Great, thanks very much, Tony. I think we have a couple of questions in the chat box, so maybe we could start with those and then maybe move to poking around on the websites if people would like.
Sure, go ahead.
All right. How about this? Why don't people posting their questions in the chat go ahead and chime in instead of me trying to read your question for you.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, I'm Spencer Lascio. I just had a question about just kind of your work in general. What kind of impacts do documentaries like, Animal, I don't even remember what it's called. It was a documentary about like big cats and wildlife trade in the U.S. What kind of effects do documentaries like that, when they become very popular, impact on the kind of shipments you see and issues you see on like a day-to-day basis with like Appendix 1? And thank you, Tiger King. I can't believe I couldn't think of that. Tiger King have on your day-to-day work?
Good question. Thank you, Spencer. Actually, it may not only just be, big cat presentations that are online, or things through Animal Planet or investigative series about wildlife, but all of that brings more awareness to the public regarding, some of the requirements that take place. And then simply the fact that, like you had seen from the presentation, there are legislation in the regards to captive wildlife that requires you to go through a process to be able to ensure that your institution is legal as far as the Fish and Wildlife Services. So I would say that it's about public awareness, is everything that is out there that's trying to bring awareness to wildlife trafficking, or institutions that promote wildlife conservation, I think are good for the service. So thanks.
Thank you.
I was curious why a number of the smaller Pacific Island nations aren't signed up to CITES. If there's any insight into that, or is there anything consistent among their philosophies that, or just their capacity, that's prevented them from signing up?
Oh, that's a great question. And I can't give you a full good answer, but I can suspect that it's just because it's hard for them to fulfill some of the requirements of getting the structure as far as the branch of permitting goes. They have to have people that are competent in being able to issue permits. They have to also have that scientific authority, which is sort of a big leg of that three-legged stool, as far as being able to produce specimens from their islands to show that it's not detrimental. So, I mean, a good example would be Palau. Okay, so if you look up, Palau is actually a CITES member, but for the longest time, they were not. So maybe, between 5 and 6 or 7 years ago, they became party members. And I'm sure that, Palau is huge as far as ecotourism. I haven't been down there. I'd love to go. But I think for some of those small island nations, FSM, Marshall Islands, it's not that, they're not allowed, or it's just that I think trying to meet some of the requirements and get sort of their structure and their act together on a legislative level, on a governmental level. So,
thanks. Thanks very much.
Hey, Mr. Palermo, great talk. Thank you. I got to say, the wildlife inspectors in Honolulu, I've dealt with them from Florida to New York to here. You've got a great crew. But I've got a question about PCR products. You know what those are?
for genetics?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You amplify the DNA from the endangered species, and all you're bringing across the border is copies of the original DNA. None of the original endangered species is in that product. And I have letters threatening me with prosecution from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife for bringing those across the border. So what's the status right now of PCR products?
Well, being the Port of Honolulu, we, as a smaller port, we don't get a lot of PCR products coming in. So off the top of my head, I don't know if there's been a change in the policy. It sounds to me like if there's no product from the original, like if it's just a copy, then you would think that there would be a means of not having to permit those specimens. But I don't want to say that with any certainty because, again, I'm not so familiar. I mean, I'm familiar with the process, but I'm not familiar firsthand with them coming through Honolulu as far as, the process goes. So if you'd like, I could see what the latest is regarding that and kind of clarify and put you in touch with people that could get, the best, most recent answer on that, Brian.
Great, thanks. I'll shoot you an email.
Okay, please do.
I got a question kind of to follow up off Brian's question. My name's Peter. I work on rare orchids. As you can imagine, I've had a ton of CITES experience working with rare orchids, mostly from Southeast Asia. My question for you is, what is the thinking behind such an extreme limitation on Appendix 1 species? What I'm thinking about is colleagues who cannot even get a permit to get an herbarium sample of something that's Appendix 1 to run genetics testing on so that we can better understand these things to better conserve them. And you can't even get a permit to do work on them. So I'm wondering, I understand the idea behind the whole treaty and it's lovely, but personally, I see a lot of shortcomings with its implementation. I'm wondering if you can talk about the logic behind something like that.
Well, first of all, you're speaking about, plant species, which are not necessarily the Fish and Wildlife's first and foremost concern as far as, we jointly enforce that with USDA, okay, APHIS. So as far as some of the nuances, I mean, it sounds like obviously you've worked with is it dendrobium specimens and species?
No.
But it's orchids in general.
Right, yeah, there's 1,000 genera in the family.
So as far as some of the specifics of, why you can't do certain things with CITES Appendix 1, that is set up through CITES, and there's a lot of exceptions when you go to drill down into that particular species into CITES, exceptions for parts and things like that. So can I ask you a question? Is that, have you gotten declined as far as when you've tried to get a CITES permit from our management authority to do the kinds of research that you're proposing?
Yeah, I mean, we've had infinite issues that didn't make sense with CITES, and I don't need to, go over them with you now. It was just a question that, a research-based question kind of following up on Brian's, where it seems like if you want to do a little research to better understand a species and thus potentially conserve it better, that getting a DNA sample would be like a great idea and a way to do that. And to have such extreme limitations on, you can't have pollen, you can't have a herbarium leaf, like it is restricted. We have been denied multiple times. I just wanted to ask, it's not we don't have to get to the bottom of it right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, all I can really say is obviously I'm not at the decision level making or at the headquarters office where I review that information as a permit biologist. But what I can tell you, Peter, is that, I do understand its complexities and I do see some limitations as far as what scientific institutions can't do. But all I can suggest is to have all of your, the research easily be laid out, and the proof as far as the non-detriment statement from that particular country that you're wanting to import them from. And all of that does matter. And if it's a matter of, you just having a conversation with a biologist to understand what is the research and exactly the provenance really of the specimens that you're trying to do your research on. As far as the structure and the Appendix 1 restrictions, again, I can't speak of that, but I could just offer suggestions on, as far as researchers, just to make sure that, you have as much information as far as the provenance, as far as, the status, the conservation status of the species in that country, and all of that research have available to a permit biologist and have those discussions. I can't offer a better answer, but thanks for, I'd be happy to try to assist in the future, but thanks for
No, that's great. I appreciate your answer, and I appreciate the talk and your time. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Somebody's asking in the chat, would the UH obtaining a COS status facilitate importing for research purposes?
Yes, it would. So what that would, but like I said, the big point would be that not only would the University of Hawaii, you'd want to drill down into the specific department. So let's say the zoology department could apply to CITES Secretariat in, Geneva, Switzerland, to become a registered institution. That would be step one. And then step two would make sure that, if the institution on the other side that you want to do transfer and donations with, they need to also be a CITES registered institution. And then the trade can happen without going ahead and having to secure one-time CITES permits, let's say.
Yeah, if I could add just one comment to maybe follow up on this discussion. So I do a lot of work on rare turtles, which are mostly CITES 1. And certainly we've had some of these frustrations getting permits in various ways. But sort of regarding the strictness of the rules, I'd say there's a need there because this is a slippery slope. In my community, there are turtle collectors, husbandrists, commercial traders of turtles that will tell you with a straight face they keep them for scientific research, and they're masquerading as researchers when really they're not. And that's kind of the problem, is like, how from a administrative point of view do you tell the difference? So maybe things like a COSI permit here could help. But I agree with some of the frustration, but I can sort of see the benefit of it as well.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Bob, for mentioning that. And you can imagine for law enforcement trying to, kind of tease out what is being kind of smuggled and what's actually being legal as far as the status and the specimens and all that. So, there needs to be bona fide research, needs to continue, right? But, it can be disguised a lot of times. So anyway, I see in the chat, it turns out that smugglers don't, apply for permits, right? Mostly you folks that are researchers at universities and zoos, etc. And I guess, the point of my discussion here, and I know maybe it was very rudimentary in the beginning, but I believe that, it's all about being the process. And, like Bob had mentioned, I was in New York in 1996 through 1999, and there were hundreds and hundreds of shipments of turtles coming in, from China and then exporting to China, and so they were coming in for zoos and collectors. But at the same token, there were folks that were actually disguising themselves as university students in the Midwest, and they were exporting, our box turtles and other species of rare turtles. And so that's where, rules and laws are utmost important to be able to catch these kinds of things. So thanks for the questions. Is there anything else?
So we're just about out of time. Maybe time for one quick question if anyone has.
Hi, so thanks for the presentation. I just have a random question pertaining to the pandemic and wildlife trade. Just in general, have you seen a decrease in the wildlife trade with hopefully people becoming more knowledgeable about disease transmission?
There has been a decrease, but I think the big decrease that we see first and foremost is through the shipments that are sort of CITES Appendix 2 or for commercial shipments. And so as far as smuggling and shipments go, I can't really speak to that, but there's always that type of a possibility. Now, for instance, mitten crabs, have they been, mitten crab season usually runs between now and February. Mitten crabs are an injurious species under our regulations and on no circumstance can be imported in the United States. So we've maybe seen a little bit of a decrease, but yet there's also been a change in the season. So the demand may not be as much because of simply the flights are not there. International flights are down to, minuscule amounts, at least for Hawaii, and across the nation, they're also way down. So the smugglers and the illegal shipments that would be depressed because of that their trade routes are not producing flights. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we should probably call things there, but thanks very much, Tony. We appreciate your time. This is super relevant stuff for many of our students who work on rare organisms, so we really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And just to let all of you guys know, you can contact me or again, when this pandemic eventually breaks, I'm willing to also come and sit down or do a presentation for the zoology department or EECB group, just as a refresher and maybe to handle some of those sticky situations and questions that maybe I might be able to be a conduit for.
All right, well, we'll stop things there. Thanks again, Tony. Everyone else, I'll see you next week.